You already know she doesn't respect you. You feel it in the way she talks over you, dismisses your concerns, or acts like your presence is optional. What you may not realize is this: it didn't start there. Women don't wake up one day and suddenly lose respect. Respect erodes slowly, quietly, the moment a man starts abandoning himself to keep a relationship alive. And the most dangerous part? Most men think the solution is to give more, try harder, be nicer. That instinct is exactly what accelerates the loss. If you keep doing what feels right, you won't just lose her respect. You'll lose your position, your identity, and eventually your self-respect. This video is not here to comfort you. It's here to show you what actually restores respect before you cross a point you can't come back from. You've probably heard the phrase, happy wife, happy life, so many times that it feels like common sense. And that's exactly why it's dangerous. Not because caring about your partner is wrong, but because this idea has been twisted into a silent rule that tells men to erase themselves for the sake of peace. That's where respect quietly starts to die. When a man believes his job is to agree, to adapt, to bend every time she pushes, he thinks he's being loving. In reality, he's training her nervous system to see him as someone without a center. And women don't respect men who don't have a point where they stop. From the inside, it feels noble. You tell yourself you're being understanding. You don't want conflict. You don't want to lose her. So you say yes when you want to say no. You cancel your plans. You swallow irritation. You convince yourself it's temporary. But from her side, something very different is happening. She's learning that your boundaries are flexible, or worse, non-existent. Picture this man. He says, "Okay, whatever you want." At first, she feels cared for. It feels easy, effortless. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, he becomes predictable. Safe in the least attractive sense of the word. He no longer feels like a man who chooses. He feels like a man who complies. And compliance is not leadership, it's surrender. Here's the part most men get wrong. She does not lose respect because you occasionally say no. She loses respect because you never do. Because when a man has no resistance, no edge, no line he will not cross, he stops feeling solid. And women don't relax around men who aren't solid. They test them. They push them. Sometimes without even realizing why. Respect isn't built on agreement. It's built on clarity. On the sense that the man in front of her knows who he is and will not abandon himself just to keep her comfortable. When you remove all friction from the relationship, you don't create harmony. You create imbalance. And imbalance always turns into contempt. So if you're honest with yourself, the real question isn't whether being agreeable has cost you her respect. It's why you became so afraid of disagreement in the first place. Why does the word no feel like a threat instead of a statement? Why does standing your ground feel more dangerous than slowly disappearing? Because until you answer that, you'll keep thinking the solution is to give more, when what's actually missing is you. A woman doesn't measure your self-worth by what you say about yourself. She feels it through your decisions, through what you tolerate, through how quickly you abandon your own values when pressure shows up. Long before she consciously labels it, her nervous system is already taking notes. Self-respect isn't loud. It's quiet, consistent, and visible in the way you move through the world. When a man respects himself, he doesn't need to announce it. It shows in how he chooses. It shows in what he protects. And it shows in what he refuses to negotiate away just to keep someone close. When that self-respect is missing, a very specific pattern appears. You start giving too much, too fast, for too little in return. You over-explain. You over-accommodate. You convince yourself that if you just do more, try harder, be better, she'll finally see your value. But what actually happens is something far more corrosive. Low self-worth turns into overgiving. Overgiving turns into silent resentment. And resentment, when it's swallowed instead of expressed, leaks out in subtle ways. Passive comments, emotional withdrawal, unspoken expectations. She may not be able to articulate it, but she can feel the imbalance, and imbalance kills attraction. One of the most dangerous thoughts a man can have in a relationship is this: I'm lucky to have her. Not because appreciation is wrong, but because when luck replaces choice, you shrink. You stop seeing yourself as a man she chose and start seeing yourself as a man who was granted access. That shift alone changes how you show up and how she responds to you. Attraction fades when masculine presence fades. When your sense of self becomes dependent on her approval, your energy changes. You hesitate. You second guess. You look to her reactions to decide who you're allowed to be. And a woman cannot admire a man who needs her permission to exist. Here's a truth most men avoid because it's uncomfortable. Women don't leave men because those men are bad. They leave when those men stop being admirable. When the man in front of them no longer feels grounded, directed, or internally anchored, something switches off. Not out of cruelty, but out of instinct. She feels your self-doubt before you ever say a word about it. She senses when your confidence is borrowed instead of owned. And once that happens, no amount of affection, effort, or reassurance can compensate for the absence of self-respect. Which brings us to the real root of the problem. Because low self-worth doesn't come from nowhere. It's usually built on one core fear, the fear that if you don't hold on tightly, she'll disappear. And that fear is where things truly begin to unravel. There is a specific fear that quietly rots a relationship from the inside. It doesn't show up as panic or desperation at first. It shows up as silence, as restraint, as a man constantly asking himself, is this worth risking her? And the moment that question starts running your decisions, the balance of power has already shifted. When your fear of losing her becomes greater than your fear of losing yourself, attraction begins to collapse. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. Because fear makes you reactive, not grounded. And women don't feel safe or attracted to men who are led by fear. Here's how it usually plays out. She crosses a line, not a catastrophic one, a small one, a dismissive comment, a subtle lack of consideration. You feel it. Your body registers it immediately. But instead of addressing it, you calculate. If I speak up, will this create tension? Will she pull away? Will I lose her? So you stay quiet. You tell yourself it's not a big deal. You choose harmony over honesty. And she notices. Not because she's consciously analyzing your behavior, but because on a psychological level, she feels the shift. The man in front of her is no longer choosing peace from strength. He's choosing silence from fear. And fear is never attractive. The man who is afraid to walk away sends a very clear message without saying a word. I will tolerate more than I should. Once that message lands, the dynamic changes. She may not respect it. She may not even like it. But she will test it. Because unresolved fear invites testing. This is the hard truth most men don't want to hear. The day you prove you won't leave is the day she learns she can do almost anything. Not because she's malicious, but because human dynamics respond to leverage. The person with less willingness to walk away always holds less power. Love is not measured by endurance, it's measured by choice. And when you stay in situations that erode your dignity just to keep someone, you aren't choosing love. You're choosing avoidance. Avoidance of loss. Avoidance of loneliness. Avoidance of facing yourself without her as a buffer. Real strength in a relationship doesn't come from control. It comes from self-trust. From knowing that you can survive discomfort, that you can survive separation, that you can survive the possibility of her leaving and still remain intact. So no, love does not mean tolerating disrespect. Love does not mean shrinking so someone else can feel secure. Love, when it's healthy, exists between two people who know they can walk away, but choose not to. Which brings us to the real question. If controlling her behavior isn't the answer, then what is? How does a man re-establish respect without becoming aggressive, bitter, or reactive? That answer begins with boundaries. Most men hear the word boundaries and immediately misunderstand it. They imagine ultimatums, threats, power games. But real boundaries have nothing to do with controlling a woman's behavior. They have everything to do with controlling your own. A boundary is not something you use to manage her. It's a line you draw to remain aligned with yourself. And that distinction changes everything. When a man lacks boundaries, he reacts. He waits for her mood to decide his tone. He waits for her approval to decide his actions. He lets emotional spikes dictate his behavior. And over time, he loses his position. Not because she wants to dominate him, but because there's no stable presence to lean against. Strong boundaries create emotional safety, not restriction. Safety. A woman feels calmer with a man who is predictable in his values, not reactive in his emotions. She doesn't have to guess where he stands. She doesn't have to push endlessly to find his edge. His consistency does that work for her. Here's where many men sabotage themselves. They confuse emotional expression with emotional control. They think that to be honest, they must be explosive, or that to be masculine, they must suppress everything. Both extremes fail. A man who loses control emotionally doesn't look passionate. He looks unstable. And instability erodes respect faster than silence ever could. Self-leadership is the ability to pause instead of react. To feel anger without being consumed by it. To address issues directly, calmly, and without needing to dominate the moment. That kind of presence communicates something powerful. I am grounded. I can handle discomfort. I don't need to raise my voice to be taken seriously. Women don't respect volume. They respect certainty. A man who enforces boundaries doesn't beg. He doesn't threaten. He simply makes his position clear and follows through with his actions. If something crosses his line, he addresses it. If it continues, he removes himself, not in anger, not in drama, but in alignment. And that's the part that changes the dynamic. Because when your behavior is consistent with your values, respect follows naturally. Not because you demanded it, but because you demonstrated self-trust. You don't need to argue your worth. You don't need to convince anyone to treat you well. Your boundaries do that for you, quietly and relentlessly. But boundaries alone are not enough. Because if your entire sense of direction comes from the relationship itself, those boundaries will eventually collapse. They need something stronger beneath them. A center that exists independently of her reactions. And that center is built around one thing most men neglect until it's too late. A purpose that leads their life, not a relationship that consumes it. Whether she ever says it out loud or not, a woman is always watching one thing closely, where your life is going. Not your promises, not your potential, your direction. She pays attention to how you organize your time, what you prioritize under pressure, and whether your life has momentum that exists independently of her. This is where many men quietly lose respect without realizing it. They make the relationship the center of their universe. Her needs dictate their schedule. Her moods dictate their focus. Her approval becomes the compass. At first, this looks like devotion. Over time, it starts to feel like weight. A man without direction becomes emotionally heavy. Not because he's demanding, but because he's drifting. When a woman senses that you don't know where you're going, she subconsciously feels responsible for your emotional stability. And once that happens, attraction erodes. Desire cannot survive caretaking. Purpose is not about instant success or grand achievement. It's about trajectory, a direction you're committed to, a path that requires discipline, effort, and sacrifice. When a man has that, his energy changes. He becomes selective. His time matters. His attention is earned, not endlessly available. Here's the mistake that feels loving but isn't. A man puts his goals on hold for the relationship. He thinks he's showing commitment. He thinks he's choosing her. But what she actually sees is a man who abandons himself under pressure. And that signals weakness, not devotion. When you step away from your own path to keep a woman comfortable, you teach her something dangerous, that your life is flexible, negotiable, and secondary. And once your purpose takes a back seat, so does her respect. Not because she wanted to compete with your mission, but because she needed to see that you had one. A man who is led by purpose doesn't chase approval. He doesn't need constant reassurance. He doesn't orbit. He invites. And that shift alone restores balance, because now the relationship exists alongside your life, not on top of it. Here's the truth most men discover too late. When you sacrifice your direction for a woman, you don't strengthen the relationship. You weaken the man inside it. And in her eyes, that weakness feels like instability. Purpose grounds you. It gives your boundaries weight. It gives your decisions coherence. It gives your presence gravity. And women respond to that. Not because it benefits them, but because it signals a man who knows where he's going. But even when you do all of this right, when you have boundaries, self-respect, and direction, there is one reality that still needs to be faced. Sometimes, despite your growth, despite your effort, the respect never fully returns. And that's when the hardest truth emerges. This is the part most men resist, because it forces them to release the last illusion of control. Sometimes the lack of respect you're experiencing is not a reflection of your failure. It's a reflection of misalignment. And no amount of effort can fix that. Not every woman who disrespects you does so because you lack boundaries or purpose. Sometimes you can do everything right and still feel unseen, unheard, and unsettled. That's not a challenge to overcome. That's a signal to listen. Compatibility isn't just about chemistry or attraction. It's about values, emotional rhythm, how conflict is handled, how peace is created. When those things don't align, respect erodes naturally. Not out of malice, but out of friction. And friction, when it never resolves, turns into distance. Many men stay because they confuse desire with suitability. They want her, so they assume they need her. But want and need are not the same. Want is driven by attraction, fantasy, and attachment. Need is driven by stability, clarity, and growth. When you ignore that distinction, you stay trapped in a cycle of trying to earn something that cannot be sustained. Pay attention to how you feel around her, not the highs, but the baseline. Is there peace or constant tension? Do conversations lead to understanding or exhaustion? Are you becoming more grounded as a man or more guarded? These questions matter more than how strong the chemistry feels on good days. Here's the truth that defines strength. A strong man does not try to reshape a woman who isn't meant to walk his path. He doesn't argue with reality. He doesn't force compatibility. He recognizes when a relationship requires him to diminish himself in order to survive, and he chooses not to pay that price. Walking away is not weakness, it's discernment. It's the ability to look at a situation clearly and say, this does not bring out my best. And that decision, more than any boundary or conversation, restores self-respect instantly. Respect cannot be negotiated where alignment doesn't exist. It cannot be demanded where peace is absent. And it cannot grow in a space where you are constantly required to justify your presence. The deepest form of power a man can have is not dominance, it's choice. The ability to stay when something is healthy and to leave when it isn't, without bitterness, without resentment, and without needing validation. Because the moment you choose yourself without anger, without blame, and without fear, that is the moment respect returns, even if she never gives it back. If there's one truth you need to walk away with, it's this. Respect is never restored by pleading, proving, or performing. It's restored when a man realigns with himself. When you stop asking, how do I keep her? And start asking, who am I becoming by staying here? Everything changes. Respect doesn't come from how much you give. It comes from what you refuse to abandon. Your self-worth, your boundaries, your direction. When those are intact, respect follows naturally. Not just from her, but from yourself. And that's the respect that actually lasts. This video was never about teaching you how to manage a woman. It was about teaching you how to stop losing yourself in the process of trying to be loved. Because the moment you sacrifice your identity to preserve a relationship, the relationship is already over. It just hasn't caught up yet. A healthy relationship doesn't require you to shrink. It doesn't demand silence in the face of discomfort. And it never asks you to trade your future for temporary approval. The right dynamic challenges you to stand taller, not disappear. So if you're a man who's done bending, done guessing, done tolerating what quietly drains you, this is your line in the sand. Choose yourself without anger, without blame, without needing her to understand or agree. That choice alone restores your power. If this message hit closer than you expected, subscribe. Not for motivation, but for clarity. Like and share this with a man who's trying too hard to be chosen. And leave a comment with the moment you realized you had been allowing too much. Because women don't respect men who lose themselves trying to be loved. But they always respect the man who stands firm, even if he has to stand alone.